We were looking at the manuscripts of the Vulgate, the witnesses, just like we've had to study with Greek and with Hebrew writings for the Old and for the New Testament, what manuscripts we have that attest to the historicity and the ancient reality of the New Testament and Old Testament books. So just like with doing that, we have to look at the manuscripts of the Vulgate. We don't just have a Vulgate that's printed on nice India paper today and that's bound in a book or something. We've got that on the basis of earlier manuscripts that first came on the scene. And we said that probably one of the most important ways to look at the manuscripts of the Vulgate was to look under regional text names. And what we meant by that was the name of a various country. And sometimes names of individuals pop up as we just have a few countries to look at again this evening, and then we'll go into some names. But we've looked at two countries thus far, Spain and Italy. So we've got the Spanish manuscripts. We gave you 4 of those. Codices Cavensis, Complutensis, Legionensis, and Toletanus. And then we had the Italian family. We looked at Sangalensis, Fuldensis, Foro Juliensis, Lindus Farnensis, and then the last one that we looked at, and we spent most of our time on last week, was Amiatinus, A-M-I-A-T-I-N-U-S. And we said that is comparable to a Sinaiticus or to a Vaticanus as far as its importance is concerned. Sinaiticus and Vaticanus are 2 important manuscripts for the Greek New Testament. Amiatinus, A-M-I-A-T-I-N-U-S, is generally thought to be the most reliable extant Vulgate manuscript, and therefore the best witness, the best textual witness for the Vulgate. Now that doesn't mean everything that's in it is right, but it certainly means that it's the most important. So, and we also said that's, by the way, that was the 5th and the last one under the Italian family. I think I also said, and maybe it needs to be reiterated, that the Italian family is the most important family, such as Codex Fuldensis, F-U-L-D-E-N-S-I-S. Codex Fuldensis was another very important one that I believe had to do with the Gospels. And you come across that in your readings, more than you do some of these others, like maybe a Foro Juliensis or something, Foro Juliensis. But Amiatinus, A-M-I-A-T-I-N-U-S, named after an abbey, an ancient abbey, is thought to be the most important. And we gave you a little history about that it comes from the country of England, of course, from one of the twin Benedictine monasteries of Wearmouth or Jarrow. But the reason we put it not under a British family, but under an Italian family, is because the exemplar, that is the manuscript from which these were taken, was evidently brought from Italy by someone we don't know, maybe Theodore of Tarsus, we don't know, but brought from someone from Italy up into Britain, and there it was copied. Okay, so for new material, tonight we'll start with the Irish family. So this is the 3rd family, but really the 4th thing that we've looked at, because the first thing we mentioned was a man's name. But this is the 3rd family as far as countries are concerned. The Irish family. We'll look at a few manuscripts here. We'll start with a manuscript called Canonicity, K-E-N-A, Canonicity, K-E-N-A-N-E-N-S-I-S. 3 N's in it, Canonicity. Codex Canonicity. It's also known just by the abbreviation of a capital letter Q. It's also known just as Q. Now, you cannot confuse that, and you won't find that nearly as often as you'll find, you'll find it referred to by its name, Canonicity, rather than just Q. But you can't confuse that with another Q that you always find whenever you're studying in the New Testament. This has to do with Vulgate here. This has to do with Vulgate manuscripts and the ancient Irish textual family, a witness to this textual family here. So this is Vulgate. Whenever you get into New Testament studies, as you'll see whenever we do New Testament introduction, we'll get into this word, quell. It's a German word. It means source. This has probably come out in one of our teachings somewhere. But as far as what's called source criticism, I'm just giving you this because That's only two places I remember where just the capital letter Q is an important letter, and it stands for something. In this regard, the second regard here, very, very important. And you don't want to confuse it if you happen to see this. Source criticism. What that is, liberal, and generally liberal scholars are the ones who try to do this. The liberal scholars of New Testament studies try to look behind. It concerns the Gospels, by the way, Matthew, Mark, and Luke particularly, the synoptic, so-called synoptic Gospels, which comes from a Greek word that means to see through the same eye. They kind of write things as though, and here's the problem, as though they're copying one another. You can jump from Matthew over into Mark and then over into Luke, and sometimes it looks as though one is copying the other. And so they have devised these elaborate schemes of telling us which one came first and which one was the dependent of another one. And then they even go behind even the Gospels and find some other things called like a proto-Luke or a Q for quell, which means source in German, as being the origin, the ancient historical origin for the written form of the Gospels that we have. For instance, kind of to simplify that, it's a broad, complicated issue we'll study in New Testament introduction. But to simplify that, it goes something like this. See if I can remember a diagram. Mark came first, and then Mark's material was picked up by Matthew, and Mark's material was also picked up by Luke, and then also an input to Luke was something called a proto-Luke, that was Luke's grandfather, and then something else that came into either Matthew or into Mark, and then would have come into Matthew, and then would have come into Luke, is Q. And that Q thing, and by the way, that Q's never been found. It's interesting how we just discuss these things, and they've never been found before. It's like evolution, we've never found a missing link yet. We've never found, why don't we find a horse with wings on it, or a bird, instead of a bird that lays eggs, a bird that gives birth to, mammals, human beings or something like that. We never found something. How is it we just happen to be living in this time where everything is complete and perfect, Well, so we just discuss that, and it's something that doesn't even exist. It's like talking about the fountain of youth and just write volumes and volumes on it. Q has never been found. Mark has been found. Matthew has been found. Luke has been found. Proto-Luke has never been found. All of these Vulgate manuscripts here have been found, but this Q has never been found. So that's in a field called source criticism. There's source criticism, there's textual criticism, you know what that is, we've done that. Textual criticism, there's redaction criticism, that old Robert Gundry out at Santa Barbara, California, the college out there has gotten in a lot of trouble for, and I think I read you in the end of some message here in the past year or so, some things about Gundry and redaction criticism, and other things we'll get into later in the New Testament. So that Q stands for quell, or German word for source. Canonicity also can be abbreviated with Q, but that stands for the Book of Kells. Kells. Kells, the Book of Kells, which is a famous book that has various different things in it. It's an 8th century manuscript. And one thing it has is a copy of the Gospels. By the way, it's named after a monastery in Ireland. Kells is the name of a monastery, an ancient monastery in Ireland. And this famous book of Kells has various things. It does have the Gospels, and the Gospels are written in some of the world's most beautiful Celtic decorations. We discussed this a little bit with some of the earlier manuscripts, the rich ornamentation and beautiful script, smooth handwriting that some of these things have been written in. I think I gave you just the natural comparison. You try to write by hand something and go very long, and then go back and measure the distance between the top of your C and the bottom of your C, and it'll just be all out of sync. The further you go, the more tired you become, the more lazy you become, and the more sloppy your handwriting becomes in. Of course, there are some people, and these were the people who were professionally trained, having an original inborn knack as well as professionally trained to do this. And there are some people today, maybe someone in the church just has beautiful, I've read some of your handwriting, just beautiful handwriting. And other people don't have beautiful handwriting, so you never want to employ them as a scribe. Only one who can read it is, the one who wrote it. We're all doctors in that regard, I guess. So it was given to Trinity College. This is at Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland now. It was given to Trinity College by that famous old man we discussed before, Archbishop Ussher. Usher's the one who said the world was made in 4004 BC, remember. And some Bibles, I've got some King James Bibles, one in particular I know at home, that you'll have dates across the top of your page. Or I think mine are found in the center column reference, the very top of that. You'll have dates. And like Genesis 1, you'll have the date 4004 BC. So we discussed that in the genealogies in the end of the book of Genesis. And we'll come up with this man. Whenever we mention things like that, it tends to degrade the man and maybe smear his memory or something. But Archbishop Ussher was perhaps the most brilliant man in the world of his day. So he was no fool. He just, and we'll come across him again, I'm sure later on when we study English translations. Ireland's right up there next to England, remember. And he's up living during that time as well whenever the important English translations come along. But Archbishop Ussher, don't think of him as a fool. You know, we make negative references to Scofield's reference Bible sometimes. Scofield happened to be C.I. Scofield happened to be a very able theologian. It's just that he also had some extreme notions and some extreme views about things. Scofield was more or less one of the founders of Dallas Theological Seminary down in Dallas, Texas. He, along with, his name just slipped my mind. Right when I started to say it, it slipped my mind. He and, he's got an 8-volume set out on systematic theology, and this fellow that I can't think of his name right now was originally, I believe, the founder and the first president there, but he and Scofield were friends. And of course, Scofield was up in this area, up in the New York area. All right, so let's go on to another reference there. We're still under the Irish family here. Secondly, we have Codex Lichfeldensis. Codex Lichfeldensis. Lichfeldensis. Louis Sperry Schaeffer. That's who I was trying to think of. Louis Sperry Schaeffer. Schaeffer was the founding father of Dallas Theological Seminary. And of course, he held a dispensational theology just like C.I. Scofield did. Scofield was a famous preacher back at the turn of the century, though, but Schaeffer was the one I was thinking of. It's an 8th century manuscript of Matthew, Mark, and Luke up to Luke 3:9, so just the first 3 chapters of Luke. And it's a book that happens to resemble the book of Kells, as far as these 2 Gospels are concerned, Matthew and Mark, because it doesn't contain that much of Luke. The third representative of the Irish family, Codex Dublinensis. D-U-B-L-I, Dublin, Ireland, in other words. Dublinensis. D-U-B-L-I-N-E-N-S-I-S. It's also at Trinity College. There are more than one Trinity colleges around, of course, but some of these are famous ones, like the one in Dublin, Ireland. It contains a New Testament done in 807 A.D. with small, beautiful Irish handwriting. It has Laodiceans after the book of Colossians, which it would fit well there, better than at the very end of the Bible, like we looked at last time in one of the other manuscripts that has the book of Laodiceans. Of course, it's a spurious book, though. And like one we also discussed earlier, it has Acts after Revelation. The rest of the New Testament is more or less like ours, except Laodiceans after Colossians and Acts after Revelation. Okay, then a 4th family, number 5 if you're on that numbering. That's the French family. We've got one important manuscript here, Sangermanensis, Codex Sangermanensis, S-A-N-G-E-R-M-A-N-E-N-S-I-S, Sangermanensis. Now this codex only has the second half of the Bible, which would mean part of the Old Testament and all of the New. And it dates from the 9th century, just like Dublinensis. Remember how we talked earlier about, and remember what we're talking about. These things we're supposed to be given a standardization of the standardization. Remember, that's what we're really talking about while we've been looking at all of this. Because as soon as Jerome's work, his original work, his autograph began to be copied, variants began to enter into the scene. And so people in different parts of the world wanted to give us a standardized copy of the Vulgate as close as possible back to the original, back to what Jerome did. And yet you always have the problem of Old Latin, the memory of Old Latin text creeping in. And so here's what we have in Sangermanensis, the Gospel of Matthew. The whole Gospel is Old Latin text and not Hieronymus text. Now the reason we mentioned this one under the French family is because what I'm going to say, it was used by Robert Stephanus, giving you the Latinized form of his name. He's better known by that form. Robert Stephanus. It was used by Robert Stephanus in 1550 in his early printed edition of the New Testament. Stephanus gave us the first printed Greek New Testament to have a critical apparatus from 15 manuscripts. Stephanus, I said, gave us the first printed Greek New Testament to have a CA from 15 manuscripts. And of course, one of these manuscripts was Sangermanensis. That's on Lit Tape 42. More things about Stephanus, and of course more things about printed editions of the Greek Bible. Sangermanensis is the most important manuscript for the French text. It has the New Testament in the following order. It has Gospels, then Acts, then the Catholics or the general epistles. In other words, it's just going to leaving Pauline out right here. Then Revelation, and then the Pauline epistles, and it closes with the Shepherd of Hermas. Another interesting point about Sangermanensis is that it has some extensive marginalia in the Gospel of John. And without going into a lot of the history, and I'm not that familiar with most of this history about this anyway, but just suffice it to say that down through church history, the marginalia in the Gospel of John, the French witness to the Vulgate text, Codex Sangermanensis, has been used for practices of divination. Of all things, to use the Bible for divination. I thought that was interesting whenever I came across that. The marginal readings in John, where the scribes have inserted various things, the marginal readings have been used to practice divination. Okay, now that's all we're going to look at as far as countries are concerned. Let's, in the next two places, number 6 and number 7, then go on and look at some other men. We started with one man, and now we're on number 6 and 7, and we'll go on and look at some other men. So next we'll move to the work done by Alcuin of York. We'll come across his name again also. Some of these names don't worry about. You can forget after you get it down in your notes. But some of these names we will come across again. Like, how many of you have forgotten the name Archbishop Usher? Probably not anyone. That's a pretty easy name. U-S-S-H-E-R, Archbishop Usher, because he gave us the dates in the Bible. Now he's more famous than Alcuin, by the way, but Alcuin will appear many different times. You spell his name A-L-C-U-I-N. Alcuin. A-L-C-U-I-N. Alcuin of York. Of course, that's up in Great Britain. He was a member of the court of Charlemagne. Now we all have heard of Charlemagne. He was a member of the court of Charlemagne. Now here's what happened. Whenever Charlemagne became the sole ruler of the Franks in the year 771 A.D., then he saw the great variety of Latin texts in his domain, and on that basis he issued decrees to correct this problem. Well, we're back to the earlier problem of trying to standardize the standard Bible. And he noticed problems among the Franks in France, and among other places where he was ruler. Now we didn't have to talk about Alcuin to see where he enters the picture. He was born in 730 in Northumbria, 730 A.D. in Northumbria. and he met Charlemagne in 781. Now, Charlemagne is just at the threshold, and we'll come across Charlemagne again also, by the way. Charlemagne is just at the threshold of the important aspects of his life as far as his ruling is concerned around this time of 781. You know, he's going to become here in just another 2 decades the first ruler of what was known as the Holy Roman Empire that lasted all the way for 1,000 years up until Napoleon's time. Napoleon lived around 1800, so 800 to 1800 is a 1,000-year period. 1,000 years for the Holy Roman Empire. And Charlemagne was allegedly, and it's hard to date exactly when the Holy Roman Empire began, but the first ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. So that's just around the corner, just on the horizon as far as Charlemagne's future is concerned. But whenever Alcuin met Charlemagne in 781, Charlemagne immediately recognized, just like Damascus had recognized in Jerome, the great scholarly abilities of Alcuin. And so in 781, Alcuin was made Charlemagne's religious advisor. He was made Charlemagne's religious advisor. Of course, most of the people back in these days, most of the rulers, were not just temporal rulers, but they had some type of input, unless they were thrown out of the church of their day, which was basically, of course, the Roman Catholic Church of their day. It's interesting, as you study all this, you end up with various theories. Whenever we get, for instance, into studying the King James Bible, King James was one of those independently minded people who came up with this. Well, he didn't come up with it, but he certainly was a staunch supporter of what's known as the divine right of kings, where the king feels, as well as maybe some other people, but the king feels that it is a divinely granted right for a hereditary monarch to be in control. What I mean by that is, if your father was king, then you have a sovereign gift from God that you are the only one to be king after that. Of course, we don't believe that today, you see. We don't say that the president's son today has to become king, and then his son, and then his son are president, on down the line. We have a different form of belief. But anyway, that's getting over into King James. It is interesting to see how these various people had many interactions, and that's what you'll find very interesting in church history as we work our way through, and how different it is today in the world as we work our way through looking at the various political leaders. Anyway, I think what I was going to do was kind of draw a picture for you of the Holy Roman Empire. If we give ourselves Greece there, we give ourselves Italy there, we give ourselves Spain and France and Portugal, and on up here into what's called the Low Countries that Hitler went through, the Netherlands, Holland, the Dutch people, and give ourselves Great Britain here. The Holy Roman Empire looked something like this. Well, really it went over here to the Franks, something like that. In other words, it cut a vertical path right through the center of the continent of Europe. That's around where the Holy Roman Empire was. Of course, it's changed boundaries all the time, but that's essentially where it was. Now, after Alcuin met Charlemagne and was made his religious advisor, he next became the abbot of Tours in 796. I'm not exactly for sure. I think Tours is somewhere like right there. I know it's in France. And I know it's down on the Mediterranean. He became the abbot of Tours, Tours. I think that city has been made so famous in Les Miserables, if you've ever seen that before. And that was in the year 796 A.D. And here Alcuin established an important school and library. And then, in a letter written by Alcuin to the sister of the emperor, around the year 800, he made reference to the fact that he was busy at work in mending a Latin Bible. Now that's really about the best proof we have of work even done by Alcuin. Around 800 is when Charlemagne became emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. There was, remember, the ancient carnal Roman Empire governed by the Caesars, but this was a religious, spiritual empire, so they called it the Holy Roman Empire. And really the best clue we have to this work around when it was done was around 800 in this letter written by Alcuin to the sister of the emperor. And he just made reference, just in passing, that he was busy. What are you busy at, Alcuin? Well, he was busy at work amending a Latin Bible. And at Tours, he actually sent for manuscripts from his native York, or up in Northumbria. So he actually was using then British manuscripts, because York and Northumbria are both in Great Britain. He actually was using British manuscripts, but he was writing down in France, and he was amending the Latin Bible, if you get all of that together. Allegedly, it was presented to Charlemagne on Christmas Day of the year 801. All of this is steeped in the mysteries of history and legend. The Christmas Day of the year 801 A.D. is supposed to have been the beginning day of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, there are many other manuscripts that come under this family, that come under the family of Alcuin, because they were works that were copied from this original work of Alcuin. The best of these, I'll just give you the most famous of these, which is not that famous, but it's probably the best as far as textual concerns are, and that is Vallicellinus, 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 Vallicellinus. Generally, whenever I mention a manuscript, I mention it because it maybe is the most important representative from a textual point of view, or because of some interesting idiosyncrasies it might have. And for this, it's both of those reasons. It's a 9th century manuscript that's written in 3 columns. And that's very rare. Why? Because most ancient manuscripts are written in 2 columns. 2 columns on a page, vertically up and down. It's very rare. So I mention it for that peculiarity. It has 3 columns instead of 2. And then number 7, we come to the Recension of Theodulf. 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 The Recension of Theodulf. He was a Spaniard, born in 750, who accomplished his work somewhere around the same time as Alcuin, around 800. He was the Bishop of Orleans, and he, just like the others, set out to correct the Vulgate variants. He used a lot of marginal notes, which in one sense were good, to say from where the variant readings came. That's even more helpful for future scholars, not just to give us the variant readings and then put whichever one you think should fit in the text and give us the others in the margin, but tell us from where they came. So that's good in that sense, but it just helped further corruption, though, because many later scribes then incorporated into the text what he had intended to be over and only in the margins. The manuscripts from his recension are not nearly as numerous as those from Alcuin's manuscripts. His first manuscript and those descendants of his, sons and daughters of his parent manuscript, are more famous and more important and more numerous, those of Alcuin and those of Theodulf. So we see that both of these last 2 groups then, both those of Alcuin and those of Theodulf, both of these last 2 groups come right at the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire in history, right at the beginning of the Carolingian Renaissance. Now, the most famous work coming from this period, however, is not the work done by Alcuin, neither is it the work done by Theodulf, but the most important work from a literary point of view coming from this period in history were the deluxe copies such as the Golden Gospels, what are referred to not by a man's name or by a country's name, but by just an adjectival descriptive name. The Golden Gospels. Most important literary work coming from the time of the Carolingian Renaissance, just another way of saying the Holy Roman Empire's era and period. The Golden Gospels, which now are in the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York City. The Golden Gospels in the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York City. These Gospels are interesting. Golden Gospels. Golden, that should tell you something of the writing. They're written with burnished gold and silver ink on purple parchment, with the Gospels in the Latin Vulgate text. You say, well, what affinities with Northumbrian and Irish relations? With Northumbrian and Irish relations. In other words, British Isles. What's today known as the United Kingdom. We don't any longer have really a Great Britain, an Ireland, and a Scotland. We have a United Kingdom. Burnished gold and silver ink on purple parchment, with the Gospels in the Latin Vulgate text, and affinities with Northumbrian and Irish families. Dates from the 10th century A.D. And they show signs of having been completed in a big hurry by as many as 16 different scribes. And so it's been suggested, like has been suggested for some earlier manuscripts in other languages we've discussed, whenever they were written in gold and silver on purple parchment or vellum, it's been suggested that perhaps this work, the Golden Gospels, this work was done for a royal visit, for a visit of a king or for a queen. We know that it was never used in the church, and it was never read by a corrector. How do we know this? Because of the multitude of mistakes in it. You just wouldn't have that many mistakes if it was ever really intended for use. Someone would have read over it and corrected it. And since it's written with gold and silver ink in purple parchment, and since there are so many mistakes, that tells us someone did it in a hurry, and since we know it wasn't one, but at least 16 different hands, you see, are discernible. Handwriting is discernible here in the text. That tends to lead some people to hypothesize perhaps the work was done on the sake of a king or a queen for a royal visit. And that makes a lot of sense. You find out that a queen or a king is going to make a scheduled visit a month from now, and you get busy to present them with this beautiful, beautiful Bible. But of course you know they'll never read it, so you're a little hasty in doing it. Give it an outward glitz to it, you know, gold and silver and purple, but you don't have to be that concerned about its reliability. And they weren't, and as a result it's not that reliable today. It's not that important as far as using it to go back to what the Vulgate really said during the time of Hieronymus. So that finishes most of the important manuscripts. Let's kind of rehearse why we've been looking at some of this. The problem of variance in textual criticism just continued. Jerome did nothing to stop that. Remember what Jerome's whole work was. It was to stop all of the confusing, conflicting Old Latin texts. And so Jerome gave us a great Bible. And so everyone said, all right, we'll stop using the Old Latin, we'll go to Jerome. And so 10 people copied Jerome and ended up with 10 different manuscripts with hundreds of different variants right there. And then somebody copied theirs, and somebody copied theirs, and somebody copied theirs. So this age-old problem of textual corruption, of variance, just continued unabated down through the centuries, even way, way past the time of Jerome, as you already well know, all the way up until the time of the invention of movable type. That's the only thing that's going to get us anywhere close to giving us a standardized work down through the centuries. So then finally, the work was picked up on a more scientific basis and a more systematic basis by groups in Europe known as correctorias. This is what we'll end with this evening now. The work was picked up more scientifically and systematically. Instead of, well, let's just make a Bible here. 16 guys get together and over a hamburger, french fries, and a Coke, just throw a Bible together, ready for the king or queen whenever they come. It was picked up, the work to standardize the Vulgate more scientifically and systematically by groups in Europe known as the capital T for thee. They were just known as, you know, like the outlaws or the bandits, the correctorias. You know, correction, correctors, correctoria. And these were societies of scholars in Europe who copied books. I'm giving you one sentence simple definition of a correctoria. These were societies of scholars in Europe who copied books listing the variants from Greek and Latin manuscripts and from the Church Fathers. That's a simple definition of one of the correctorias. A society of scholars in Europe who copied books listing the variants from Greek and Latin manuscripts and from the Church Fathers. And they presented to us what we call correctories. You've heard of a church directory. These are correctories produced by these groups of scholars. Now these are very, very important. They move us up into the 11, 12, 1300s AD, you see. So we're moving way up into the Middle Ages now, way beyond all of this early handwritten stuff done by, well, maybe a well-trained scribe, but done back in the 600s or 700s or 800s AD or something. We're moving up half a millennium past that time to these groups of correctories. And of course there were many different ones, and I'm going to only mention two of these, I believe. First of all, I'll mention what Wordsworth and White say is the best, and that is the Vatican Correctory. So if you see this term anywhere like Vatican Correctory, it doesn't necessarily have to do with Vulgate, although most of these do have to do with the Vulgate. But just know that it was done by the Correctorian, who the Correctoria were. The Vatican Correctory, this was the work of 40 years by a Franciscan scholar by the name of William de Mara. Over 40 years of his life he worked on this. A Franciscan scholar, William de Mara, M-A-R-A. And the Vatican Correctory is mentioned by Wordsworth and White. You say, who is Wordsworth and White? Well, in the next week or so will be to them. They're probably two of the most important names in Vulgate studies, and we just haven't gotten to Wordsworth and White because they come way up in recent times. But they're mentioned by, he is mentioned, and the Vatican Correctory is mentioned by Wordsworth and White as probably being, in their estimation anyway, the best Vulgate correctory that's available. They go by different names, obviously, depending on where the work was done. So just have that down, that the Vatican Correctory is probably the most reliable correctory, at least according to the opinion of Wordsworth and White, and they are two men who deserve our attention whenever they make some pronouncement like that. However, that's not the most interesting correctory. The most interesting correctory is the Paris Correctory. The Paris Correctory. This was produced around 1226 AD by theologians and scholars at the University of Paris. And that, by the way, probably makes it the earliest correctory, the Vatican Correctory coming maybe in the next century. But the Paris Correctory is rather corrupt, though. I mean textually corrupt, not nearly as reliable as is the Vatican Correctory. So you say, what's interesting about the Paris Correctory? Well, not just the Paris Correctory, but this Paris group of scholars here. Maybe we should say the work done in the Bible, in the Vulgate, by Paris scholars, is really important because it introduces us to another subject that I want to close with tonight, and that concerns the enumeration of chapters in the Bible. The enumeration of chapters in the Bible. Prior to the 1100s AD, referring to anything in the Bible by a chapter number was relatively rare. You know, like you say Matthew 14 or Mark 16 or Luke 3. Prior to the 1100s, referring to anything in the Bible by a chapter number was relatively rare. But after this time, from 1100 onwardly, the practice became very popular and widespread because of the introduction of the system of lectures in the universities. The introduction of the system of lectures in the university obviously gave rise to this need. Now what I mean by that is prior, well let me show you what I'm talking about. If you'll open your Bible over to the book of Hebrews, I'll show you what I'm talking about. You know how helpful it is for us today to have the Bible divided up in chapters. Not only to find things, but think if you're lecturing on it, instead of saying, this is found somewhere in Psalms, or this is found somewhere in Genesis, it's much better to say where it's found. Even if you can't give the verse, to at least be able to give the chapter. Well, you see, there was really never a need, because it was until you have what we do, like right here in this church, until you lecture about things all the time. You can't just say, all right, here's a verse in Psalms, and you're writing that down, and then I'm giving you another one in Malachi, and then 4 in John, and then 8 over here, and you just have spread out over your paper the names of the book. How, if you don't already know? Most of you know where these scriptures are because you've studied the Bible. But how, if you don't know where they are, will you ever find them then, if you don't have chapters there? Or if you've got chapters and someone doesn't tell you the chapter, how will you ever find? And you can't go to concordances and these types of things. How would you ever be able to find it then? Well, see, there really wasn't a need back in ancient days, even in Bible days, in the New Testament. There was really never the need to refer to things by a chapter and by a verse, and therefore they essentially had no chapters and no verses. And what brought the need of this on the scene for the first time really was the system of lectures that began to be developed in scholastic circles in the universities of Europe. And chief among those was the University of Paris. So I'm telling you essentially how and why and where you actually have gotten your chapters that you have in your Bible today. For instance, look at this. Hebrews 2. Have you ever noticed this? Let's start with verse 5. For unto the angels hath he not put in subjection the world to come whereof we speak. Now watch verse 6. But one in a certain place testifies, saying. Now that's their way of referring to things. How do you like that? How do you like that? The vagueness of that. One in a certain place testifies. And he goes on to quote Psalm 8, not Job like my margin has, but Psalm 8. What is man that thou art mindful of him, or the son of man that thou visitest him? Okay, now who said that? Who was the one? Well, David. And where's the certain place? It was a certain place, all right, but where was? Psalm chapter 8, you see. We would today say like Psalm 8 and whatever verse that is, I don't know, that must be like around verse 4 or something. Psalm 8:4 we would say, but they never really had a need for that. We're back in 1st century time, and how did they refer to it? One in a certain place testified, saying. Now we know many times they'll at least give us who the one is. And they'll say, as was said by Isaiah the prophet. But where did Isaiah say it? You see, we don't know. You have to go either know it, or someone can give you chapters, and then someone can refer to it by a chapter and or by a verse number, and you can go back and find that. Now, if some of you are thinking way far ahead of me, maybe I better catch up with you and jump over into the book of Acts, because you may be thinking, well, sometimes they refer to it, by a number, by a chapter number. Well, the only time that ever happens is the book of Psalms, though. And you see, Psalms is a unique book because each psalm was a book in itself. They were finally collected and all put together. I'm thinking of, what am I thinking of? Yes, just looking right at it again. Acts 13 and verse 33. Someone's thinking way far ahead of me. You might could think, well, sometimes they do refer to it by a chapter number. But that's only with regard to the book of Psalms, and they don't normally do that. I mean, that's very rare that you'll find. I don't even know that I can think of another time. I certainly can't off the top of my head anyway, but another time in the New Testament where they refer to the old by a chapter number. God hath fulfilled the same unto us, their children, in that he hath raised up Jesus again, as it is also written in the 2nd Psalm. So obviously we didn't get our 1st, 2nd, 3rd Psalm from the Paris scholars in the 13th century A.D. This was way back in these days. But you know enough about the book of Psalms to know it's unique in the Old Testament. All the rest of that was just either one long book together, Genesis, or one long prophecy together, Jeremiah, just all together. Psalm was written by different people in different circumstances at different times, and therefore kept separate as 1 and 2 and 3, and then someone, and who that was we don't know, got them together and put them in that order. And they must have been essentially in that order by this time, because that 2nd Psalm that he's talking about happens to be our Psalm too as well. Now he could have said the 2nd Psalm, and it could have been for us the 98th Psalm. The critics probably would have loved that he was wrong. Well, no, he was right, we would say, and we're the ones that are wrong. He was right back in those days because he's closer to the original time. And it was the 2nd Psalm then, and someone rearranged all of them. All you have to do is change the numbering on them. And it's not that important. I mean, let's face the facts. Who cares what the number of it is, as long as we have the Psalm? But they did refer to it like that in those days. But most of the time it's just Isaiah said, Jeremiah said, Joel said, Amos said, Malachi said, or how about Moses said? We got to skip over 5 books looking for what Moses said there. And today we refer to it by a book and by a chapter and by a verse. Sometimes, for instance, in John chapter 12, they would refer to certain circumstances under which a message was given or an event took place, thus hoping to help the person get back there more quickly and be able to know what they're talking about. I'm in John 12, verse 38, that the saying of Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled, which he spake, Lord, who hath believed our report, and to whom hath the arm of the Lord been revealed? Now, he doesn't give us anything, but Isaiah said that. We know it's 53, but it doesn't matter what you want to call the chapter. It's still the same thing. Therefore they could not believe, because that Isaiah said again, He hath blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts, that they should not see with their eyes, nor understand with their heart, and be converted, and I should heal them. And where is this? Well, he tells us, these things said Isaiah when he saw his glory and when he spake of him. Now, many times he'll give us a reference to certain circumstances during whose time this prophecy was given or this event took place. We know that he saw his glory there in Isaiah 6. He looked up and saw the Lord high and lifted up, and his train filled all the temple. We know about that. That's chapter 6. So he didn't just say Isaiah said like he did here in verse 38, and he doesn't tell us how or where, or give us any reference to where this was said. But when we get to that next time he quotes Isaiah in verse 40, now he gives us a clue by giving us verse 41. These things Isaiah said, verse 40, not verse 38. Can't put one before the other incorrectly, or go back and draw both of them unnecessarily together. When he saw his glory and when he spake of him. So, many different systems, you see, of listing the chapters of the Bible were introduced. And the scholars at the University of Paris decided to, standardize this system of giving chapters to the Bible. Remember, there were many different ways. Maybe Matthew 13 for us was Matthew 7 in someone else's classification. It was Matthew 20 in someone else's classification. Someone needed to standardize that for us so that we all have the same chapter, so that we can discuss things, so that you can lecture and your pupils can understand what you're talking about then. So it's to the scholars at the University of Paris then that we are indebted for giving us the system that was then, through their work and through their lectures, to their pupils, and their pupils went out and lectured and became scholars in other universities, and they used what their professors had taught them, that we owe our present-day listing of chapters in the Bible. So in the year 1228 A.D., Stephen Langton, who was a Ph.D. at Paris, later Archbishop of Canterbury. Stephen Langton, Ph.D. at Paris, later Archbishop of Canterbury, as well as the leader of the barons in their struggle that gave us the Magna Carta, gave England that and us some of our laws through that. Stephen Langton in 1228 gave us the system of chapter and numeration that substantially is ours today. And it came to us through the Vulgate. Now try to picture all this without getting confused in your mind. They're writing Matthew in Latin, and it's just you start at the beginning and you just write as much as you can put on that page and turn the page and keep on writing. No divisions at all. No verses, no chapters, no divisions, just all there together. So it's a big help for us that someone first of all standardized, and then various people began giving us, I just put a period here to this chapter. Well, it's to the scholars at the University of Paris, you see, that we owe a debt of standardizing, and specifically to one of them, Stephen Langton, in 1228, standardizing the chapter and numeration system that substantially is ours today. And they, of course, were doing that in their work on the Vulgate. They weren't working with English Bibles. English Bibles, in most regards, hadn't even been invented yet, so they were working with the Latin Bible. And here's how they did it. Each chapter was marked into 7 divisions then. Now, they weren't paragraphs, but they were divisions. The chapter itself was, for the most part, divided from, the preceding work and then set off in the following work on the basis of subject matter, the content of it. Now, many people, and we are included in those many people, have cried out against some of the very, very poor divisions of some chapters. So many different ones come to mind. Joel chapter 2, chapter 3 or something. Malachi. Some things it's sewn together perfectly, you almost hate to put it in a chapter then, because you're almost breaking the sense of what's going on right there. Matthew 20 versus Matthew 19. I think maybe the last verse should have been brought over as the first verse into Matthew chapter 20, and various things like that. So they would try to find where is the break in the train of thought here. And then we're going to start a new chapter right here. Take Romans. Let me just give you a good one. Take Romans 5 and 6. I was trying to think of a good one. Now, this may sound like a good break to you now that we're accustomed to it, but it's really not a very good break, because it's a break right in the midst of the same train of thought. Look at Romans 5 and 6. Now, 6 and 7, that's a good break, because look, he's been talking about slaves of righteousness versus slaves of sin, and then he ends with this verse, the wages of sin is death, the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. And then he says, know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law, how that the law hath dominion over a man as long as he liveth. And he goes on to talk about women and men. Well, that's a good division. Chapter 6 doesn't talk about that any. But let's look at some last few verses here in chapter 5. Moreover, the law entered that the offense might abound, but where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. You know, the abounding subject there. That as sin hath reigned unto death, even so might grace reign through righteousness unto eternal life by Jesus Christ our Lord. What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Well, we're right back to what we were talking about in the last part of verse 20 there. The very poor chapter division. They should have all stayed together. Let me see if I can find... I gave you one over in Matthew. The last verse of Matthew 19 really should go with Matthew 20. And you can just flip through there and find so many different poor divisions, as I know we pointed out in the past. So anyway, as I was saying, once they got their chapter, then it was divided up into 7 different sections. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. They gave us A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. Those were 7 divisions, not paragraphs, not verses, but 7 divisions. So I guess what I'm saying is they gave us not only chapter divisions, but then they tried to divide the chapters up for us, which more or less we could count it as a forerunner for the verse divisions of the Bible. Now some chapters were so short, like some of the Psalms are so short that they could not go the full length all the way to the letter G, but they may only go to B or C or D or something like that. But most of the chapters, most of the regular chapters, Stephen Langton would have set apart from the one before, the one after, and then have that one divided up into A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. The verse division, just to make that study complete, although this is totally off the subject of the Latin Bible or Vulgate studies or the University of Paris scholars, the verse divisions were probably given to us by Robert Stephanus. We mentioned him earlier tonight, at Geneva in 1551. We've discussed that on an earlier tape as well, chapters and verses. But here we've discussed chapter divisions in a little more detail. The scholars at the University of Paris, in giving their lectures, wanted to standardize a system of chapter enumeration, and it was done by Stephen Langton in 1228. And so then several hundred years later, Robert Stephanus at Geneva in 1551 gave us our verses, and they were probably brought into the English Bible. That was still in the Latin Bible. They were probably brought into the English Bible by William Whittingham of Oxford in 1557. Some people think that he was related to Calvin, marrying Calvin's sister. I think I've even mentioned that before, but I'm not so sure that's true. But we'll cover William Whittingham again, because William Whittingham is one of the men who gave us an important English translation of the Bible. He certainly knew John Calvin. We know that much about him, though. So that gives us our chapters in 1228, and then our verses in 1551. that then were brought over into the English in 1557. Okay, that's all we're going to look at then as far as the manuscripts are concerned. Then that will save us with the printed work, the printed edition of the Vulgate that we'll start looking at next time then.